My name is Pat O'Mahony. I've been working with the Food Safety Authority for 18 years now. GMOs, novel food, irradiated foods, food allergens, etc. But I suppose the biggest job I have in the last 10 or 15 years is novel foods. So I suppose we all know that food science and technology has been ongoing forever. And if you look at pasteurization back in the 1800s, that was novel in its time, and it did get some resistance at the time as well. But it's moved on. Now it's standard practice. In fact, it's mandatory for milk and some other products. Ionizing radiation, I won't mention it, but it fell into the GMO trap about 20 years ago. GMOs, new technology here will be UV light, UV treatment. I'll mention that later. Those of you who have high cholesterol are probably taking plant sterols or plant sterols. They would have gone through the novel food regulation. Edible packaging, I don't think it really has caught on. I mean, do you want to eat something that's been handled by 10 or 20 different people? It was a concept many years ago, but I don't ever see it on the market as such, so they don't all pass mustard, I suppose. Animal cloning is a bit of a phenomenon, but it's not really a food issue. It's an assisted reproduction issue, and Dolly the sheep is stuffed up in a museum somewhere in Scotland. You probably won't see cloned animals on the food market for some time. Nanotechnology, I'll mention again in a minute. Now, when it comes to the future of food, and because of the work I do, I see what's coming through, I see the trends, I see the new foods. Some of these you might see or know of already. Insects are coming our way. There's about 5 or 6 different applications in the novel food process at the moment. In some parts of Europe, they're already on the market not by design, but by accident as such, and that's going to stay the case until they're authorised. In Ireland, where we find insects in a place, we shut it down because they're not authorised here, they're just not on the market. In vitro meat, instead of raising cattle on a farm, you can grow it in a lab. It's at the concept stage, but it's moving quite rapidly apparently in certain parts of California. It's got obvious benefits in that you don't have the environmental issues that you would have with raising beef, but it's a long way from the market yet, and whether it ever makes commercial feasibility is a good question, I suppose. Fish oils, omega-3s, DHAs, etc., it's moving away from the fish. It's now being made in genetically modified microorganisms in large vats, in large containers. Because of the quirks in the legislation, you don't have to label it as GM, but still you're taking the healthy oils as such, and they're not from fish. And then you have traditional foods like baobab and chia seed, chia seed was mentioned early on. So these are all new foods, new trends, and you can go and see it later on. I'll show you the website where you can look at such trends. So I'm not going to throw heaps of legislation at you. I'm going to mention one or two that are, I suppose, primarily important for the average business that wants to bring something new on the market. But on top of all this plethora of legislation, you have the breakup, shall we say, of the EU and Britain, which will make our lives a bit more difficult. But as we heard earlier, and from other people, it's going to make businesses' lives a bit more difficult as well, from probably more a commercial and economic point of view. So if you want to put a new product on the market, and if it's a food additive or a flavouring or an enzyme or a GM food, you have select pieces of legislation and you just go and follow those, so they're fairly straightforward. But what happens if you're none of these, and I'm missing a few in there obviously, then you fall into the novel food regulation. And putting it simply is, a novel food is something that hasn't been on the EU market before 1997, May 15th. Nothing special about that date, that's just when the legislation came in. And that came in around the same time as GMOs, when there was a bit of controversy and a bit of scaremongering. So while they were legislating for GMOs, they said we'll cover the rest of the food supply as well. It also includes processes, and I'll show you what I mean by that later. So if you have a new product, a new ingredient, or a new source of a product or ingredient, then you want to check that it's not novel, because a lot of clients of food ingredient people are now asking, before they take a new product on, they will ask, have you covered novel food, or is it authorized fully? And then they're coming back later and finding out that in some cases, oops, we haven't got that authorization. And it's not an easy process, it's costly, it's time consuming. So it is, and one of the reasons we go to business meetings like this is to, I suppose, inspire food businesses to check their ingredients to make sure they are covered by the current legislation. So the novel food legislation as it is, it's changed as of January 1st this year. Now there's a suite of legislation. It might look a bit awkward, but what it does now compared to the old legislation, all you need to know about putting a new food on the market. So you have different pieces of legislation, but you also have guidance from the European Food Safety Authority on how you put a dossier together. You can still come and talk to us, but it's now all centralised. Up to the end of last year, you had to go and find a competent authority in a member state. Not all of them would be accommodating. Of course, you wouldn't go to Germany because an English German wouldn't get on well. We got a lot of non-Europeans coming to us because of the English language, and the same with the UK. Now it's all centralised, so you go through the Commission, who then go to EFSA, and some of the benefits are obviously the centralised authorisation system. It's now a generic authorisation, so if I went and got a product authorised up to last year, it was only I had the authorisation. If you wanted to put the same product on the market, you had to go and do the same thing yourself. Now it's a generic authorisation, and there's good and bad there. Good in that you don't have to reauthorize it 50 times if it's a popular product. Bad if you're the company that went to the bother and the cost of getting it authorized in the first place. But there is one way around that. You can get a 5-year protection, a sort of a patent if you like, if you can demonstrate that you've used proprietary data in getting that authorization. It gives you a 5-year stay before anybody else can put it on the market based on your application. There is a new option there as well for traditional foods from third countries. So if you remember the chia seed and the baobab fruit from Africa, they might have, if they had been coming through the system now, they might have gone for that option. And of course, there's now 10 categories of novel food rather than the 4 that there was. More bureaucracy, but that's the way it is. So nanomaterials, I'll talk about them later. They're mentioned. Insects are now novel. And there is a very useful Article 4 in there where if you want to find out is something novel or not, there's now a formal application which you can do. In the old days, you rang around, you had a look at who knew what. You might ask the Commission, but you could be going around in circles for years before ever finding out. Now you can go to a single member state, ask them to submit a request to them, and then it's a formal answer, and that goes into the centralised Commission website. I won't go through this in detail, but there is a gap down here where before it went to the member state, now it goes straight to the Commission. This is your application. Straight to the Commission, onto EFSA for I think it's 9-month period, they have to assess it, and then it goes directly, if it's a positive assessment, it goes for a vote at the Standing Committee. So it's been shortened by a lot, it's been straightened out a lot. There's only one chance for member states to object. There was a second chance here, which kind of elongated the process over the years. If you are an innovative company and you want to know what's trending, what's on the market, what's going well, you can go on the Commission website here and look at the union list. This is the list of all novel foods that have been authorised. And it is useful for showing you, right, there's a lot of omega-3 oils or whatever coming through the system. So it'll give you the food categories where they're allowed in, the maximum levels, and it gives you the specifications of that as well. So in the new system, if you have a product that matches the specifications and you can restrict it to those food categories, there's no more required. You just put it on the market and that's it. In terms of novel processes, there aren't that many examples. I suppose high pressure pasteurization is one that a lot of companies are using for processed meats. It was put through the system way back in 2000 for fruit juices. It's a way of reducing the microbial load, extending shelf lives without the possibility of decreasing the nutrient viability that happens sometimes with thermal pasteurization. More recently, we have Monaghan Mushrooms, who used UV light to increase the vitamin D content in mushrooms, which is virtually zero as they're grown in the dark. But when you give them a few pulses of UV light, you all of a sudden get a certain level of vitamin D, which is nutritionally significant. This also works for milk. A Dairy Crest company in the UK also UV treat their milk. Initially it was for extending the shelf life, but they discovered it also increases vitamin D levels, so they get a double whammy. So these are the only 2 ones at the moment I can point to, but I know there are pulse electric fields, cold plasma, and a bunch of other ones that are intended for extending shelf life and for reducing microbial loads, but they could also have other benefits as well. Nanotechnology, if you're a food business and somebody offers you something with anything nano in it, run a mile, because the legislation in this is quite clear at the moment. It's novel. Any mention of nano and you're you're going to be looking for authorization. And what happened with nanotechnology is it's around 10, 20 years, and it's got great potential in the medical field. We're already using it in squash rackets, tennis rackets, cosmetics, car batteries. If they ever do become popular, they'll be quicker to recharge. Computers, paints. So in the industrial sector, it's already there. But what happened was when they brought it into the food, or they decided that they would try and bring it into the food sector, and it would mainly be in food packaging. They decided to have a look-see, was there any problems? And of course, there are potential serious problems. So what you're talking about nanotechnology, you're talking about way down here between 100 and 1 or less nanometers. And what happens with certain organic materials is that they change. Obviously, you've got a very small size, so they can get places in the body through cells, through cell walls, through nucleus. They can get to places they can't get at the higher level of micro or millimeters level. But they also change in their physical, chemical structures and reactivities. So when they did start to look back, and already EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, have looked at titanium dioxide, silica dioxide, and it's looking like they'll be taken off the market purely because even though they weren't authorized as nano, there is a certain significant amount of nanomaterial in them, and they just don't know the actual health implications of that. It might be nil, it might be small, or it might be huge. So there's more products being looked at, mainly in the additive side of things, but it's something that if you're a food business, I'd be very wary of at the moment. They are classed as novel, so they will require an authorization, and I suppose these are the issues you're looking at. Insects, this might seem a novelty here at the moment, but as I said, if we ever found them in a shop or a grocery store here, they'd be shut down straight away. In Europe, and I presume we're talking ex-colonial countries, like Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, they found them on the market more or less. They weren't meant to be there, but they were found in such large quantities they couldn't actually just go and take them off. Nothing wrong with insects. In fact, if you look at a lot of the research, they're actually healthy. They're a good source of protein. They don't have the same environmental impact as raising cattle would be in terms of greenhouse gases and stuff. They are novel, and there are 4 or 5 or maybe 6 applications in process at the moment. So these are coming your way. You probably won't eat them as like this, but you possibly will see them in protein bars, burgers, or protein fillers, and they are a good source of protein. EFSA have done a preliminary study on the safety of these, and they say basically it depends on what they eat, so garbage in, garbage out. So that's one thing to look at. So you've gone through all the authorization processes, and you want to say, right, I have this product which we're fairly sure it does this or does that. In 2006, the Nutrition and Health Claims legislation came in, and it was brought in basically because the food industry lost the run of themselves. There was all kinds of wild, spurious claims being made. So this is what happens when you don't cop on as such. Politicians and other people get a hold of it. So they brought in the Nutrition and Health Claims legislation, and it may have gone the other direction now. It's impossible to get a health claim onto anything, a health or nutrition claim. But this is the way it is, and this is what you have to do. So in some cases, people won't bother go to the trouble of authorizing a food if they can't make their claim on it afterwards. So, if you're at the early stages of innovation, make sure you check, is it easily authorized, and can I make the claim I want to make on it? I'm going to finish up with GMOs. This old chestnut has been around for 20 years. Whether you like them or not, they're around for 20 years. Nobody's died or got sick, and they're pretty much harmless, depending on what you do with them, of course. In fact, if you're a diabetic, a type 1 diabetic, you're injecting GM insulin. If you eat cheese, you're probably eating GM chymosin. So it's all around us. We're eating it as we speak. In most cases, you won't see it labelled, especially in foods, because there are ways around it, as they say, where every rule has an exception as such. There's a lot of the rest of the world have moved on with GMOs, but Europe has, I suppose, been stagnated by certain member states and NGOs as such. The process, I can safely say, this is probably the biggest failure in European legislation with zero pass rate as such. Every time an application is made, it fails, and it falls by default back to the Commission to authorise it. So you've seen it here first. This is the biggest failure in terms of legislation. But when you're talking 28 member states, they find it hard to agree on anything. Biggest problem coming for, I think, Ireland and possibly the EU is Brexit in this term, and this is my only input to Brexit. At the moment, the voting pattern at this level here and at the appeals committee, there's about a third vote against the GM product. There's about a third vote for it, and then there's somewhere about a third abstain, purely on political grounds. The UK always vote with the science, as does Ireland. But the balance is so tight. If and when Brexit occurs, that big block will be gone from the positive side, and there will be situations where the GM or GMs, food and feed, will be rejected as such. Now, is that a problem? Not really, not for us. When you ask retailers, they'll say there's nobody knocking down our doors to get a GM carrot or a GM this, that, or the other. But where you will see a problem, and it's not just for Ireland, but for the whole of Europe, including those member states who vote consistently against GMOs, we are protein deficient when it comes to animal feed. Ireland would be in a bad way if we didn't have access to those North American, South American markets: soya, maize, rapeseed, and sugar beet. So I suppose from a feed perspective, this is where there could be trouble when the UK leaves. Depends on I suppose, the sentiment in Europe. What happens? You have to go and buy non-GM feed, which is going to rise the price of food, and there you go. That's my input, short and sweet, so I hope I didn't rush through that too quickly.